East Asia remains the fulcrum of US security strategy and alliance management. The Trump administration's approach to the region is defined by renewed tensions over Taiwan, a complex Korean peninsula, and evolving defense ties with Japan. As Beijing intensifies pressure on Taipei and Pyongyang continues its weapons testing, Washington must balance deterrence with diplomacy while maintaining credibility among allies. This panel will explore how the second Trump term is shaping US security posture and regional partnerships. Will America pursue a more assertive deterrence strategy or seek selective engagement to manage risks? And how will East Asian states adapt to the shifting balance of power? These questions lie at the heart of what this discussion will come on to. And to help answer these questions, we have a fantastic panel with us today, moderated by Dr. Edward Howell. Dr. Howell is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford. His research expertise focuses on the politics and international relations of North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and East Asia. He specializes in North Korea's domestic and foreign policy, particularly its nuclear program and the relations between North Korea, the United States, and the wider international community. As with the other panels, there'll be time for questions in the second part, so please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. But I shall now hand over to Edward.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on from where you are calling. It's very, very good to be here and to have such an excellent panel to discuss what is a very, very timely issue. First on our panel, we have Shihoku Goto, who is the Vice President of Programs and the Director of the Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She specializes in trade and economic interests across the Indo-Pacific and is also focused on geopolitical developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. She's a columnist for The Diplomat magazine and a contributing editor at The Globalist, and is also a member of the Global Taiwan Institute's US-Taiwan Task Force. Welcome. Our second panelist is Dr. Sung-Yoon Lee, who is a principal fellow at the Sejong Institute in Seoul, in South Korea, and the author of The Sister, The Extraordinary Story of Kim Yo-jong, North Korea's Most Powerful Woman, an acclaimed book, a book that has been received to critical acclaim, published in 2023. Dr. Lee has testified as an expert witness at the US House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs and Subcommittee on Asia hearings on North Korea policy, and has also advised senior officials and elected leaders, including the President of the United States. It's a very warm welcome to you. And last but by no means least is Yuki Tatsumi, who is a senior director at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. She previously served as Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center. Prior to that, she has served as a Research Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and as the Special Assistant for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. A very warm welcome to you. I'd like to start this discussion by allowing each of the panelists around 5 minutes just to offer their own introductory thoughts, your own introductory remarks and thoughts on this very broad topic of Taiwan, North Korea and regional security before we proceed to some more in-depth discussion and questions. And as Charlie mentioned, for those of you in the audience, please do use the Q&A button to type your questions as the discussion continues. So without further ado, we'll start in the order that I've mentioned. Shihoku, welcome. Over to you.
Right. Well, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here, and what a great time to be discussing this topic. My marching orders were to focus on Taiwan initially. And let me start with the headline. US relations with Taiwan under the Trump administration are on steady footing with room for improvement. And the foundation for this cautious optimism in the near term are twofold. One is that the United States continues to be committed to remain an Indo-Pacific power. The latest visit by Trump to across the region was a net positive, certainly when it comes to US military commitment, which I know Yuki can elaborate further on. That has been exemplified, partnerships with allies, which is critical, not just for the region writ large, but also especially for Taiwan. That remains solid. And then secondly, Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC was good insofar as there was no mention of Taiwan. The two countries focused on their respective immediate concerns, which focus on tariffs and economic issues. And Taiwan was not used as a pawn and not used as a bargaining chip between these two superpowers. But let me focus on three issues, which are lost opportunities. One, at this APEC meeting, the United States could have followed the lead of Japan and met with the Taiwanese representative at that forum. It did not. There was concern from Washington that such a meeting would lead to an outcry from Beijing. But of course, there's always going to be outcry from Beijing, and it's oftentimes performative on the part of China. And the threat is only rhetorical and not necessarily going to lead to immediate action. But had the United States had that meeting with their Taiwanese counterpart on the sidelines of APEC, it would have made great progress in reassuring Taiwan about America's political strength to push back against China. And this is important because there is growing rapid distrust in Taiwan about US reliability. China has stepped up its own disinformation campaign about support for the island, but the Taiwanese opinion polls have found that many are concerned about Trump's unwillingness to stop a Chinese invasion. A Taiwan Opinion Poll Foundation poll last month found that 45% of Taiwanese were concerned. In spring of this year, Brookings here in Washington found that 41% of Taiwanese have a negative opinion about the trustworthiness of the United States, and that compares to 24% only a year ago. The second point, the second lost opportunity for Trump in recent months has been that Taiwan's leader, Lai Ching-te, was expected to stop over in the United States before heading to Guatemala and potentially Belize and Paraguay, which are, of course, three of the 12 sovereign states which continue to have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The fact that the United States did not allow that stopover by the Taiwanese leadership was an active decision by the United States. It did not want to jeopardize trade negotiations with China. Because it wanted to reach a deal when it comes to critical mineral exports. But this was at the cost of losing support of the Taiwanese regarding the steadfastness of the United States to Taiwan. And then finally, the lost opportunity has been on the trade front. The United States has imposed to date a tariff of 20% on Taiwan. 20% is very high. It's higher than what it's imposed on Korea and Japan, which is 15%. Of course, there are exemptions on exports from TSMC and other high-tech exporters have been exempt from these tariffs, but companies that produce machine tools and parts will be hit by these tariffs. So if the United States is to exemplify and really make sure that US commitment to Taiwan is strong, one of the areas that it could move on is to lower or even eliminate tariffs, make Taiwan the exception to the rule, and eliminate those tariffs. So let me stop there for now.
Thank you very much. Some fascinating insight there, particularly in terms of the challenges with respect to the second Trump administration and its own policies toward Northeast Asia. Definitely something to talk about later on. Sung-Yoon, over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. the decades-old North Korea problem, which is a morbid mix of nuclear and missile menace and crimes against humanity, today stands on the precipice of a resolution on Kim Jong-un's terms, unfortunately. After being feted by President Xi Jinping at the Victory Day military parade celebrations on September 3rd in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, rubbing shoulders with Vladimir Putin, the three authoritarian leaders, Xi, Kim, and Putin, examining with some curiosity China's rollout of its latest assemblage of weapons of mass destruction, Kim dramatically elevated his international status, projecting the image that he's on a par with the leaders of China and Russia, and this has implications. I think Kim Jong-un's markedly elevated status is a factor. It gives North Korea greater leverage in dealing with, negotiating with even the United States of America. So Kim Jong-un today, I would venture to say, stands to gain what he has sought for many years, what his father has sought for decades, which are tacit acknowledgement by the United States that North Korea is a veritable nuclear weapons possessing state. Second, talks on mutual arms reduction, disarmament talks with the United States. And third, perhaps even a peace treaty and discussions, negotiations on the normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and North Korea. What is my basis for this fancy projection? Well, President Trump himself, on the eve of his Asia trip that Shihoku mentioned, and during the visit, repeatedly implied that he would be amenable to making these concessions. For example, on Air Force One, President Trump told the press, I think they are sort of a nuclear power. They got a lot of nuclear weapons, I'll say that. That's a direct quote. And asked on board on Air Force One whether Trump would seek to meet Kim Jong-un during this Asia sojourn, President Trump replied, quote, I would. If you want to put out the word, I'm open to it, and added that, quote, I have a great relationship with Kim Jong-un. On his way to Japan after visiting Malaysia for the ASEAN summit meeting on October 27th, Mr. Trump told reporters that he would be amenable to even extending his stay in South Korea if Kim Jong-un were agreeable to meeting him, whether at the Inter-Korean border village, Panmunjom, or perhaps even in Pyongyang. President Trump said, yeah, it's pretty easy to do. Yeah, I would do it. If you'd like to meet, I'm around, you know. I'll be in South Korea, so I can be right over there, meaning North Korea. The meeting did not take place for a variety of reasons, but I think it's almost inevitable that at some point, maybe as early in the next year, 2026, such a summit meeting is likely to take place. And at the summit meeting, I think it's also more than likely that President Trump will make the concessions that I've mentioned. Again, recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power, gradual suspension of sanctions, followed by mutual arms reduction talks, and even talks on the normalization of diplomatic relations between the two nations. None of this was, well, it was perhaps conceivable, but none of this was practicable before fall 2024. That October, in October last year, we know that Kim Jong-un dispatched over 10,000 combat troops to Russia to fight against Ukraine, dramatically changing the calculus. And also, we had the re-election of President Trump, Donald Trump, the next month in November in the presidential election last year. Now, one might say that even North Korea's dispatch of combat troops was predictable. I think it was quite predictable. And many people, many voters in America predicted Trump's victory, but the two have merged into forming this slightly ominous is perhaps too strong a word, but concerning alternative future that may be upon us. If the United States, I don't think the US will, but if it is inclined to abscond its traditional role of defending Japan and South Korea in the future, what should the two democracies in the region in Northeast Asia do? Well, obviously band together, Japan and South Korea, reach out to other democracies, Australia, New Zealand, friends in Southeast Asia and beyond, and of course, European states, to form a coalition against the three nuclear weapons possessing autocracies in Northeast Asia, a very rough neighborhood, if I may say. That is China, Russia, and North Korea are veritable nuclear powers. So this is an alarming new reality that we must face, that we must prepare for. And on that very happy note, I'll close for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sung-Yoon, and I'm sure we'll come back later to discuss some of your points, particularly about the Trump-Kim Jong-un relationship. Before we do so, Yuki, over to you.
Great. Picking up right from the theme that Sung-Yoon left us with, which is kind of a quote-unquote happy note, or his I'm always impressed with that eloquent way that he describes this whole thing in a very nice, simple, easy to understand picture. But thank you again for having me here. I'm greatly grateful to join with my friends and colleagues here on this panel. So talking about U.S.-Japan alliance, which is my homework, I think Prime Minister Takaichi's summit meeting with President Trump couldn't have gone better, especially given the fact that this always gets lost in the media reporting and sometimes at times critical description of how Prime Minister Takaichi performed, perhaps, is that this woman has been in the office barely a week. And he pulled that off. And that is no small accomplishment. And that really should be appreciated and noticed. And it does speak to her capacity, potential capacity, as a strong leader that she strives to be. She had one job in that summit and one job alone, which is to present herself as an equal to President Trump and present herself as a reliable and trustworthy partner for Washington, which I think she did very successfully. And what also I should highlight is President Trump's basically reciprocating the he was gracious. He was overall performed very well, behaved very, very well. He actually looked almost genuinely happy to spend time with her. He inviting her to ride along on his Marine One on his visit to USS George Washington. Again, it's quite remarkable given that this really is the first time that two leaders met. And I think she was very successful in anchoring U.S. continued commitment to the U.S.-Japan alliance, for one, but then also to the broader cause of free and open Indo-Pacific. But I would like to highlight, though, is what she did while she was in APEC, but then also preceding to her summit meeting with President Trump in Malaysia, that she really begins to make a connection with leaders in Southeast Asia while she was visiting Malaysia. And then also she pretty much did the same thing while she was in APEC. And I would very much like to highlight her meeting, not just with the Taiwan leader, but then also Korean President Lee. Everybody was watching that with a bit of an anxiety because there was definitely a certain level of anxiety about Prime Minister Takaichi's policy trajectory and her track record of being a conservative politician in Seoul, and how that could reflect into their conversation, I think was a big focus. And I was watching that very closely too, but I was very pleasantly surprised that the two leaders seemed to have hit it off quite well. And then I think President Lee's comment following the summit meeting with Ms. Takaichi was very encouraging. He did say something to the fact that, yes, I was concerned about some of the policy stance I had with her, but after having a very good discussion with her, I really have no such worries anymore. And I think this not only goes to the fact that the two leaders really begin the personal connection, but then also the geopolitical reality that Sung-Yoon mentioned, that Japan and Korea now does face a shared challenge in the little bit of a more than unpredictable U.S. Sustainable commitment to the deterrence in this region. And then also the shared cause of needing to deter North Korea from being acknowledged as a full-blown nuclear power. And if at all possible, continue to hold on to the goal of irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. So I think I really think that U.S.-Japan alliance and also the other trilateral relationship, like U.S.-Japan-Korea, can be really an anchor with which that all the like-minded allies and partners, and then that certainly includes Taiwan, can leverage to make sure that U.S. remains committed. And then I think in President Trump's foreign policy circles, what is really encouraging is the fact that Secretary of State Rubio seemed to be very steadfast in his support for the alliance relationships. And while there was a lot of anxiety preceding to the President Trump summit with President Xi, it was really Secretary Rubio who went on to the record talking to the reporter and said, Taiwan will not be discussed, plain and simple. That is off the table. And I think that did go some way to clear some level of anxiety that was held not just in Taiwan, but then also Japan watched that very closely too. And then I'm sure Seoul was watching that very closely. So I think there are a lot of good things that came out of the U.S.-Japan alliance. But I think real work really begins now for Prime Minister Takaichi, both foreign policy-wise, but also some of domestic agenda. She already rolled out a quite ambitious economic revitalization agenda. A lot of that hinges on whether she can hold on to the power and continue to build his political support within Japan, beyond her own political party. So I think a lot still has to be remained seen, but then I think I will remain cautiously optimistic that she could follow the pattern of Prime Minister actually Koizumi, who really leveraged his popularity in foreign policy and then also among public, and really leveraged that to push his own agenda that he would like to accomplish in economic realm, which sometimes could be sticky in the Japanese domestic political contest. So I'll leave it at that, and then look forward to the questions and further discussions.
Thank you very much, Yuki. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing some excellent insight. And a reminder to our audience that if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the question and answer, the Q&A button that you can see on your screen. I'd like to start the discussion off just by talking about the US commitment to East Asia, something that all three of you have touched upon. We've often been told that Trump is not really a fan of alliances, that Trump doesn't want alliances to continue. He's not very happy about the 28,500 US forces Korea stationed in South Korea. But at the same time, as of yet, we have not seen any real US disengagement from the East Asia and from the East Asian region. Now, part of this could be due to the fact that Trump is an economic hawk towards China, and deterring China economically is a big goal. I guess another part could be he wants to make sure that allies do pay for their fair share of their defense alliance with the United States. What do we think this might mean, and what might this look like, particularly in terms of the respective areas in which you've discussed? I mean, Taiwan, Japan, as well as South Korea, perhaps.
Maybe I'll take a first crack at it, and my colleagues can, of course,
Yes,
pile
please
on.
do.
I think one thing that, if anything, we learned about President Trump from his first term in the office and second term since he started this January, is that he really moves on his instinct. And as unpredictable as he is, and as unconventional his logic may be at a lot of times, he does look at the bottom line. And then I think that his bottom line vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific is that he instinctively, not logically, and then not an elaborate policy manner, but at instinct level, I think he does understand that Indo-Pacific region is fundamentally critical for the health of the U.S. economy. And for that, he does understand that with all the misgiving he may have about multilateral institutions, it didn't go unnoticed by me and perhaps many others that only think, he basically skipped all the multilateral engagements and he just focused on the bilateral engagements in every stop of the way. So as much as we all know about his awareness about multilateral institutions and engagements, he does, he doesn't like the fact that U.S. economy, U.S. runs so much trade deficit with all these countries. He does understand that it'll be detrimental to U.S. economy to disengage.
Mm, mm,
And I think there flows his other policies. That is my kind of a preliminary reading of it. And that is why I think he's so much focused on these Asian major trading partners, on a high-end industry trading partners into the deal that makes them invest in the United States. But then also, I think he does understand that, and he does understand that um, engagement with the Indo-Pacific region comes in two packs. Trade is one, political economy is one. And then I'm seeing a trend that, under him, we are now seeing, again, almost like a Cold War era-like, trying to separate the conversation on a trade and commerce sphere, and then also on one hand, and the political, economic, and alliance management sphere on the other. But unlike Cold War era, this is more of a Shihoku's expertise, but there is a connecting tunnel between the two. That's called economic security.
mm,
So I think that's what's new. And then I think that's what makes President Trump's decision making or policy making, if we're not looking into his brain, frankly, no one could, but makes even more unpredicting. But I think he does understand at his instinct that this region is fundamentally important for the United States, and U.S. needs to stay committed and engaged. It's just that his image of engagement and commitment can be taking wildly different form from his predecessors.
mm. No, some excellent insight there, and particularly in terms of the unconventional logic that you mentioned with respect to the value of the Indo-Pacific, particularly from an economic perspective. Shihoku, shall we go to you next?
Yeah. So I agree with Yuki. One point that I do want to make, though, is that the United States under the Trump administration, and indeed under the Biden administration, does not still have a clear China policy, right? On the economic front and on the security front. And the China policy that the United States may or may not espouse could differ quite a lot, especially when it comes to economic relations with China, from Japan or from Taiwan or from Korea. What we are finding as the United States engages in a trade war essentially across the region is that the United States can have the upper hand when it comes to economies that are significantly smaller than it is, and that the relationship is not that of an equal footing. And so that we see that from Japan, from Korea, where the United States was able to impose tariffs. And of course, both Seoul and Tokyo were able to negotiate down the tariffs from the initial proposal that the Trump administration put forward in April. But nonetheless, these tariff rates are still considerably higher than what they were a year ago. When it comes to China, the United States is finding it very difficult to have a kind of upper hand because both the United States and China have a chokehold on key areas on both sides, right? So on critical minerals, China has the upper hand, and it is using that in negotiation tactics with the United States. On semiconductors and advanced technologies, the United States has an upper hand. And so we are seeing a truce that is being developed between the two sides, but it's only a truce. It's a limited time. This is a time for both sides to regroup, and the outcome is not clear. But we also need to know that there is an opportunity for countries around the region, the middle powers of the region, to also reassess the landscape and come up with new alliances and partnerships, and especially when it comes to economic interdependence. There is an understanding on the part of Japan, on the part of Korea, on the part of Taiwan, that decoupling was never on the table. And even the idea of de-risking from China is very differently defined from the United States. And I think the definition that Japan has about economic security, and especially when it comes to enhancing its own capabilities so that it is less vulnerable to Chinese coercion, and this was seen especially in the rare earths area, because Japan had been hard hit by the export bans imposed by China over a decade ago. And we've seen Japan partner with Australia, partner with some key Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia. We've seen benefits of that. And I do think that the United States actually has a lot to learn from that kind of longer term strategic investment so that it too has economic resilience, so that it is less vulnerable to the weaponization of China's economic might. So that could be the way forward for these countries to work more closely together.
Thank you. We'll go to Sung-Yoon next, and I know Yuki, you've raised your hand, so I'll come to you afterwards. Sung-Yoon, anything to add, particularly from the South Korean and North Korean perspective as well?
There was a lot of apprehension on the eve of the first Trump-Lee Jae-myung summit, which took place in late August 25th. And about 3 hours before the actual meeting, President Trump texted on a social media platform that what's going on in South Korea? There is purge and revolution, oppression of religious freedom, and so on. So I think many South Korean officials, perhaps President Lee himself, were a bit on the edge right before the first meeting between the two leaders. But that summit meeting actually went very well, as did the follow-up meeting at the APEC summit in Gyeongju. So I think there has been some rapport formed between the two leaders, as there clearly is between Trump and the new Japanese Prime Minister, Takaichi. So that's good. No name calling, no red-faced outbursts, which one can't always take for granted when it comes to Donald Trump. So I think we are standing on firmer ground in the bilateral relationship that is between the United States and South Korea, but things could change. Things could change, and it's all up to Kim Jong-un. Whether he invites President Trump to Pyongyang or invites him to a meeting at Panmunjom remains to be seen, but I think it's more likely than not that that kind of another summit pageantry will take place. And what I'm concerned about is what kinds of concessions that President Trump would make to Kim Jong-un and what Kim Jong-un would ask of President Trump in return. I think Kim Jong-un, arguably, I would argue, is the most successful of the three supreme leaders, his late father and late grandfather. Of course, Kim Jong-un inherited the state, this political entity called the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's based on the foundation built by his father and his grandfather. But Kim Jong-un, by my count, has killed only one South Korean, not literally, but during the Kim Jong-un era, North Koreans have shot and killed one South Korean at sea in September 2020. Whereas during his father's reign, there have been many incursions, many small-scale attacks, and under the grandfather, there were even many more. Yet, Kim Jong-un enjoys the kind of elevated status that I mentioned in my opening remarks that neither his father nor grandfather ever could have dreamed of. So, he is projecting this image that he's on a par, is the same kind on a same kind of level as an international head of state, as a recognizable head of state, alongside President Xi and President Trump and President Putin. And that is sort of, if not a total victory, that is an accomplishment that we have to take into account. We, as in the democracies in the region. So, sorry to go off on a tangent, but I think President Trump does understand. I agree with everything that Yuki and Shihoku said. He understands the value, the importance of the two allies, Japan and South Korea in Northeast Asia. And I think both South Korea and Japan, together with Taiwan, should start talking about what one side can offer the other, what Japan can offer Taiwan, what Taiwan can offer Japan, what South Korea can offer Taiwan, and what Taiwan can offer South Korea, in case there is a contingency in the Taiwan Strait or in the Korean Peninsula, or even a problem, a disaster that strikes Japan. I think talking about such logistical humanitarian aid or even military aid among the three powers, among the three nations, is necessary at this point to project the message to China that we are united in protecting our interests and safeguarding our freedom.
Thank you. Some excellent insight there, particularly in terms of North Korea, drawing North Korea into the equation. Yuki, you had your hand up very briefly earlier.
Oh, you know what? I will just let the other question to move forward. But just to very quickly, picking off of what Sung-Yoon just said about more better connectivity between Japan, Taiwan, and Korea about the for the contingency or disaster relief planning. I would like to throw in the Philippines into the mix because they're really the key partner when we look at the Indo-Pacific as a whole, because the Philippines also have a growing interest in engaging more with Taiwan, Japan, and then also I'm sure with Korea nowadays. And as we know, Japan and Philippines now have the reciprocal access agreement through which Japanese self-defense forces can start making port visits. Filipino armed services can also visit Japan in the same way. They have access to each other's facilities and so forth. So that connectivity can also be leveraged in perhaps not in the military, perhaps maybe not in the military sense during a peacetime. These four countries have plenty of things to talk about when it comes to disaster relief. All these countries are very prone to large-scale natural disaster as we just recently experienced. So there are a lot that can be done in terms of improving the connections, sharing information, kind of sharing the disaster assistance schemes and protocols and procedures and so forth. So I would just throw that out for future, as the leader for this discussion.
Thank you very much. And actually, on the subject of Taiwan, we have a question from one of our audience members. Does the panel think that a Chinese move against Taiwan, the questioner hasn't defined this, so we can make of this what we will, a blockade or something else. Does the panel think a Chinese move against Taiwan would receive a credible military response from the US? Or, as was with the case with Russia, could Beijing get Trump into a position where he might not react?
If I can just start the conversation.
Please do.
The US national defense strategy has yet to be released in its full form. But we know the headlines. There will be a focus on the US homeland, and there will be also a focus on the Western Hemisphere, right? So those are the two focus areas. That means that the Indo-Pacific is not there. That means that there isn't a lot of prioritization, at least at first blush, about the United States coming to the defense of Taiwan. When the strategy is released in its fullest, the expectation is that there will be reference or a significant chunk devoted to Taiwan, but we're still playing a wait and see approach. What I can say is that, as you said, Edward, defining an attack it's very loose, right? I would argue that China has already attacked Taiwan aggressively through aggressive disinformation campaigns to destabilize society and sow seeds of doubt about the unity of the international community to come to its defense. Taiwan has come under considerable cyber attacks. It is very vulnerable to blockades. These are areas where we need not just coordination amongst allies and partners to help come to the defense of Taiwan, but also Taiwan can do more for itself as well. One point I do want to make as well is there can be greater coordinated effort to defend Taiwan's international standing. So that China is engaged in hard military defensive capability strikes, like the capacity is growing. There's great concern about that. And I would say that a full-on invasion by China to Taiwan is unlikely. However, they're doing a lot of economic coercion, and they're also engaged in lawfare to squeeze out Taiwan from the international organizations and to delegitimize Taiwan's status. And this is an area that is actually a low-hanging fruit for the United States and the international community to come together, to come to the defense of Taiwan. So I would like to kind of put that into the mix as well.
Thank you, Shihoku. Yuki, Sung-Yoon, who would like to go next?
Yeah. So I would go since there's a reference to a national defense strategy. There has been so much focus on the fact that U.S. is going to focus on homeland defense. Here's a reality check for everybody who all the viewers and chiming in. No sovereign nation will ever deprioritize homeland security. And for historically speaking, too, all the past U.S. national defense strategy always had homeland defense as its first priority. Now, I would argue that addition of the Western Hemisphere is a bit of an interesting addition. But from the way that this administration has been behaving so far in the Caribbean and toward Venezuela, for example, I take that focus of the Western Hemisphere not as a regional focus, but their definition of homeland defense becoming more elastic to include Western Hemisphere, as they seem to have been expanding the definition of national security into counter-drug operations, for example. And I don't really think that, of course, there will be a resource, on and off, tit for tat, and that I think that is clear as the United States is really trying hard to lower its physical presence in Europe, but hasn't really touched anything in terms of movement of the asset or allocation away from the Indo-Pacific command areas of operations in terms of a fiscal sense. Now, we're still waiting for the national defense strategy. So it's kind of, let's wait to see until how that portion will play out. But my sense is that priority of homeland defense is nothing different from its previous national defense strategy, because all the past administration have done that in the past. But what is more interesting is, what does that mean that now this particular Pentagon seems to be extremely trigger happy in terms of sometimes using disproportionate asset vis-a-vis something that may be quite ably be handled by a Coast Guard, for example. So I don't know what that does to the fiscal situation there as well. But having said that, though, I do agree with Shihoku that U.S., Japan, Korea, other like-minded partners can really go after that low-hanging fruits of supporting Taiwan's international space. Japan, for example, has historically been quite supportive of Taiwan's membership in the WHO, for example, or as at minimum as an observer status. That can be more coordinated and enhanced for something like that. And then I think it is quite important to notice that European countries seem to be engaging a little bit more forward-leaning, in the sense that there were a lot of EU Parliament and parliamentarians visiting Taiwan. The countries which has really not has spoken openly about their desire to see free and open Indo-Pacific or peace and prosperity across the Taiwan Strait. They have begun to articulate that, including UK. That's very important. I think because so many of the countries have unofficial ties, close ties, but still unofficial ties with Taiwan. And then that is the reality of the game today. The best we could, but there are still a lot that these countries can be doing to support Taiwan's democracy and push back collectively against any coercive measure vis-a-vis Taiwan. And then I am quite worried about China's disinformation campaign, not just within Taiwan, but then in other countries as well, to kind of portray Taiwan as kind of a pro-independent separatist destabilizing force, which is not which is not helpful, and which hurts Taiwan's effort to maintain its presence in the international space. So I think the countries like Japan, US, Korea, and other like-minded out of the area partners can do more in terms of collectively pushing back against such narratives.
Thank you, Sung-Yoon. I mean, I guess something just on my part to add is there seems to be a lot of discussion of a dual contingency. If something happens with respect to China and Taiwan, as the questioner posits, and then in the event of some partial redeployment of the US forces Korea to serve a broader regional role, North Korea might view this as an opportunity to provoke the South. Just something to add in there. Over to you.
Absolutely, I agree. North Korea would be perhaps even foolish not to capitalize on such a contingency to put more pressure on South Korea. Here in South Korea, I get the feeling that the vast majority of the South Korean people who have no first-hand experience of war, the Korean War, feel optimistic, on the verge of perhaps being overly complacent, believing that there will never be a war because there has not been one in over 75 years. Whereas if you look at the period, about the 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, there are at least 5 major wars in and around the Korean Peninsula. The first Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, the first Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and then that short period of intense fighting between the Soviets and the Japanese dispersed throughout Manchuria in the last days of the Second World War. There was actually a plan to employ Koreans for the invasion of the Korean Peninsula led by the United States. There was an agreement signed between General Bill Donovan, the head of the precursor to the CIA, and the Korean nationalist leader, Kim Koo. But that plan became unnecessary in the wake of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My point here is a war could break out in Korea. It's not an impossible proposition, yet I think because the vast majority of South Koreans have no first-hand experience or even memory of any kind of war directly affecting South Korea itself, tend to feel, therefore, there will never be a war in Korea. And also feel somewhat that is many South Koreans, the majority of South Koreans, I would venture to guess, feel unmoved by the suffering in Ukraine. I mean, as an abstraction, yes, there is sympathy for the suffering people of Ukraine, but when it comes to policy, what percentage of the South Korean population, say, would support sending South Korean arms to help Ukraine, or even combat troops? Very little, very few people would support that kind of policy. I think there is something akin to general solipsism when it comes to such concerns. South Korea feels it's not South Korea's business to meddle in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So there is this, problem of mentality at play, which favors, unfortunately, the other team, Team North Korea, Russia, and China.
Fascinating points there, particularly about this axis, for lack of a better word, between China, North Korea, Russia, and perhaps to a lesser extent, Iran. And as you've all mentioned, there is a need for the US, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, collectively to do something. The question is, what is that something? Another question from one of our audience members, following this line of thought, asks, could the panelists say something about the Japan-South Korea relationship and how this affects dynamics in the region? We've already heard and seen the meetings between Takaichi, the newly elected Japanese Prime Minister, and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, for instance. And we saw meetings between Lee Jae-myung and Takaichi's immediate predecessor, Ishiba Shigeru, prior to his resignation. So Japan-South Korea relations. Over to you, to the panelists. Who would like to offer some immediate thoughts on this?
There was some concern about Lee Jae-myung's statements in the past with respect to Japan. Many were less than complimentary. When, for example, the Japanese government made the decision to release the treated water from Fukushima, Lee Jae-myung said this is a second Pacific War that Japan is waging against Korea, South Korea. Anyway, well, President Lee has been very practical, very pragmatic, and has hit all the right notes when it comes to mending fences with Japan to date, and also in dealing with President Trump. So I think President Lee is able to suppress any inhibitions or ill feelings toward Japan he may personally have as the national leader of the Republic of Korea. He's only into the first 6 months or so of his term, but so far, so good, thankfully. And I think the summit meeting between the two leaders of South Korea and Japan went swimmingly, very well, as well, with the new prime minister as well as the predecessor. So far, so good. And I think this sensitive relationship, bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo needs to be managed, but I think both sides are doing all the right things for now.
Yuki, anything to add here?
Yeah, I agree. I really was encouraged by the atmospherics after the Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee's summit. They seem to be very cordial to each other, and then I think um, as Sung-Yoon mentioned, Prime Minister Takaichi as well. I think she is following her example. This is not exactly Ishiba's, but Prime Minister Abe's example of basically prioritizing national interest, Japan's national interest, and pragmatism, and let her guide that. And then I think that so far she has been resisting the pressure internally to, be more unapologetically conservative, which does in that case, if she went that way, it does create quite a concern in Seoul. I think she is wise to stay her, keep continuing to resist that pressure. And then because I think there are much bigger things at stake by managing and maintaining a positive, constructive, cooperative relationship between Japan and Korea. And then it is very encouraging to see that two leaders are both doing their best to reciprocate that pragmatism with one another and basically prioritizing their respective national interest. And then also, I think, like I mentioned briefly in my opening remarks, there is a sense of, I think, probably there is a sense of a shared interest and shared challenges. Two countries both, continue to, as much as stable the relationship is bilaterally with Washington, given that this president's temperament, it could flip overnight. The both leaders both have a challenge dealing with that. They both continue to, have a pressure from Washington when it comes to trade and continued implementation of the trade deal, so to speak, especially on the investment in the United States sides of the bargain. So I do think that now they have, in a sense, greater sense of a shared purpose in making sure that this relationship is stable, and that will work well, both in their relationship bilaterally with Washington, but then also trilaterally between the three capitals, but then also vis-a-vis North Korea and China.
Can I
Thank you.
just add one thing to this very quickly? The strength of both Japan and Korea is that they're both vibrant democracies. The weakness of these two countries is that they're vibrant democracies. For now, the two countries have an understanding that foreign policy interests are aligned, that they need to focus on where the shared challenges. But right now in Japan, Takaichi is very popular. Her support rate is over 70% by any opinion poll. And if you look at, and what's very heartening too, is that support for her by generation is extremely high amongst youth voters. According to some polls, those in their 20s, 90%, those who support Takaichi, those in their 20s are the biggest supporters of Takaichi. And as the generation gets older and older, her support actually wanes. So hopefully the momentum for her to continue to focus on foreign policy interests rather than pandering or catering to domestic power politic issues will continue to persist. But again, this is politics, and she is also in a somewhat vulnerable position insofar as she's creating a coalition government with a new party that is literally a new party that has no experience being in government. And so that could sway some of her political drive as well. So again, the persisting prevailing theme of this conversation, I think, in general, is about cautious optimism. I remain cautiously optimistic, but there are risks ahead as well.
Thank you very much, Shihoku. And I think cautious optimism, yeah, sometimes pessimism is realism, being pessimistic is realistic. And there are a whole host of other issues pertaining to the region that we will have to look out for in the future, particularly as Sung-Yoon mentioned, any prospects of Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting. We know they didn't meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit. They didn't meet in Trump's visit when Trump visited South Korea. So what might the prospects mean there? And what might the prospects mean for North Korea's denuclearization as well? I think we are about to run out of time, sadly. Thank you very much for those of you who asked questions, and I'm sorry that we were not able to answer them all. I'll now hand back over to Charlie.
Thank you very much, Edward, and thank you for moderating. Thank you to all the panelists for their time and their insights. It was a very rich discussion about East Asia's security landscape and economic and political considerations as well. So that brings us to the end of this two-day conference. We've had 6 fantastic panel discussions featuring 24 experts discussing all the regions of Asia, in all the different areas, from security to technology to geopolitics to energy and economics, and much more. So we're extremely grateful to all of our speakers over the 2 days, and to all of our moderators, and of course to the audience for sticking with us, even though it's not been the most optimistic of discussions. And also a big thank you to the FCDOA and the IIAS for supporting this event. If anyone would like to find out more about the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and our upcoming events, or about becoming a member, then please visit our website. Otherwise, all that remains to say is another big thank you to this final panel and to everyone for taking part in this conference. So thank you very much.